if you were to take a trip out of this sanctuary and down those double doors at the back and all the way down the hallway to the far end of the Faith Formation wing, you would find yourself at the Campbell Chapel, dedicated in 2018 in honor of Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite Campbell. And if you were to leave the church and head out on Amherst Street to Edgewood Cemetery to lot 14R, you would find a grave marker with the names of Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite Campbell. Who were these people? Why is our chapel named after them? And what can their life stories teach us? These are pictures of Jeffrey and Jeffrey and Marguerite when they were young. And some of you already know the story of the Campbell family. Some of you know the whole story, some may know pieces, and some may not ever have heard of these names. Jeffrey and Marguerite grew up in Nashua in the early 20th century and attended the Nashua Universalist Church with their mother, Lillian Campbell. As adults, Jeffrey became a Universalist, first a Universalist, then a Unitarian Universalist minister, and Marguerite worked for the Unitarian Universalist Association for many years. Despite their commitment to our faith, both Jeffrey and Marguerite faced racism and discrimination from Universalists, Unitarian Universalists, and the institutions of our faith throughout their lives because they were Black. We like to think that our spiritual ancestors have always been on the right side of history. But Jeffrey and Marguerite's stories make it clear that this has not always been the case. Here at UU Nashua, we first learned about Jeffrey, Marguerite, and Lillian in 2017. Their story and its origins in this congregation had been forgotten to this community. In 2017 and 2018, we embarked on a journey of learning about the family, telling their story, and reconciling with the actions of our spiritual ancestors. We designed a service about the Campbells that members of the congregation did here and brought to several other congregations in our region. We reached out with a formal apology from our congregation to Jeffrey Campbell's daughters. We held a service of remembrance and reconciliation. We rededicated our chapel as the Campbell Chapel, and with the blessing of Jeffrey's daughters, we raised funds to place a stone on the previously unmarked grave where Lillian, Jeffrey, and Marguerite are all buried. We also committed at that time to make sure that this story was not lost to our community again. And it has been 6 years now since we last shared the full story of the Campbell family in a worship service. So it felt like it might be time to share it again. Whether this story is new to you or you remember it well, I invite you to hear it today with an open mind and open heart, that we might continue to learn from it and work together to make our faith the shining light in the world that both we and Jeffrey Campbell believe it can be.
Jeffrey Worthington Campbell was born in Boston on March 1st, 1910. His father, Jeffrey Sr., was Black and made his living as a commercial traveler. Jeffrey's mother, Lillian, was white. Her marriage caused a significant rift in her relationship with much of her family. Jeffrey's sister, Marguerite, was born in 1916, and Jeffrey Sr. was killed in a racially motivated attack when Jeffrey was 12. We have not been able to learn any details of what actually happened. The family moved to Nashua around 1919. Young Jeffrey, after doing some church shopping with his mother and sister, decided to attend the local Universalist church. Jeffrey, Marguerite, and Lillian became active members of the Universalist church, but almost from the beginning of their time there, Jeffrey remembers suspicious whispers about him and his sister. as the only black children at the church. In his essay, Personality, Not Pigmentation, Jeffrey writes of his early experiences of prejudice at the Nashua Universalist Church. Excuse me. Quote, "By the time I was 12 years of age, the paradox between intention and action of Universalism was shaking that little church. Self-satisfied middle-class people that they were, they had nevertheless been attracted by a faith which preached the fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man. That message had struck sufficiently deeply for them to realize that they could not preach or accept that belief while excluding the only youngsters of mixed parentage in the neighborhood. With each stage of my development, the paradox grew sharper. Should I take a role in this or that pageant? What would the conference say if I was to represent the church? Should I be asked to teach a class? Would it be safe to hold box socials where anyone's daughter might be? Despite this, the Campbells remained involved in the church, and when he was 13, Jeffrey and his mother officially joined as members.
After graduating from Nashua High School, Jeffrey Campbell was accepted to the theological school at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. He was the first African American to enter this school, and his presence immediately presented a challenge and soul-searching within the Universalist denomination. Though the dean of St. Lawrence, John Murray Atwood, recognized Jeffrey's gifts and believed he should be given a chance, denominational officials were less sure it was worthwhile to support Jeffrey on his path to ministry. In Personality, Not Pigmentation, Jeffrey wrote of his experience with the committee that granted him fellowship as a minister. Quote, "I shall never forget the Committee on Fellowship which examined me for ordination. 30 minutes on my theology and 4 hours on my politics and racial attitudes. Finally, the committee voted for ordination. It did so with more travail of spirit. They wanted their church to be the kind of institution which could unite its theory with its practice. Inwardly, they knew it was not, nor within the limits of their imagination could they see it becoming such. Failure to ordain me would have been an even more flagrant confession of that same failure." End quote.
Ordination and a search for settlement was also a fraught path for Jeffrey. When the Winthrop, New York Universalist Church wrote to the National Universalist office asking about whether or not they should ordain Jeffrey, the response from the superintendent, Roger Etz, was less than enthusiastic. He said, "Personally, I have no color prejudice, and theoretically there should not be any in our churches. Practically speaking, however, there is bound to be. I hardly know what to advise in regard to his ordination. Of course, if it is carried through, he will expect us to try to find him a church, and frankly, I don't know where he can be located. My own feeling that this problem ought to have been faced squarely by the school long ago, and that it was a mistake to let him feel he could finish his course and then secure a church."
Roger Etz was not far off in his predictions. After being ordained in 1935, Jeffrey was unable to find a permanent position in ministry. His race overshadowed all other considerations of his resume, despite supportive and glowing recommendations from the people who knew him. At times, Jeffrey was even attacked by other Universalists for his desire to serve as a Universalist minister. John Van Schaik, editor of the Universalist publication The Christian Leader, wrote in an editorial in 1940 that it is fine if a, quote, young colored man desires to enter a white theological school to get an education and has his ideal the service of his race. If, however, he despises his race, wants nothing to do with it, insists that he intends to join the white race, serve white churches, marry a white girl, we should tell him to go elsewhere, end quote. Though Van Schaik did not mention Jeffrey by name, the reference was clear.
During the mid-1930s, Jeffrey supported himself with part-time and temporary positions, in the process becoming an activist and leader in Universalist youth ministry. In 1939, Jeffrey won a scholarship to study theology in England from the peace organization Fellowship of Reconciliation. Shortly after he arrived in England, World War II began. During the war, Jeffrey declared himself as a conscientious objector and supported himself after his fellowship expired by teaching young returning soldiers and their families. After his return to the United States in 1951, Jeffrey took a position teaching English literature at the Putney School in Vermont. He remained on the faculty there for the rest of his life, while also trying repeatedly to gain a full position as a UU minister. He never succeeded. The closest Jeffrey came to a settled minister was a part-time ministry at the UU Society of Amherst, Massachusetts from 1967 to 1974. This was a period of great civil rights upheaval in American society and within the UU faith, culminating in 1969 when the Black Affairs Council, or BAC, walked out of the Boston General Assembly over funding and black empowerment issues in a predominantly white faith organization. At that General Assembly in 1969, Jeffrey gave the prestigious sermon at the service of the living tradition. His sermon was entitled, "The Road of Every Man." No copy of that sermon has been found. From Amherst, Jeffrey went on to serve as an on-call minister for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brattleboro, Vermont, a position for which he was not paid. Something that Jeffrey wrote near the end of his life in a letter to his friend, Reverend Dottie Spruill, was that he had never been invited to preach from his home pulpit here in this church in Nashua, our church.
Jeffrey was not the only Campbell to suffer from racial prejudice and discrimination at the hands of the Universalists and the Unitarian Universalists. His sister Marguerite encountered similar resistance. In a letter to us, Jocelyn, one of Jeffrey's daughters, referred to her Aunt Marguerite as the saddest woman I've ever known. In 1939, Jeffrey officiated the wedding of Marguerite and Francis Davis, a white man who studied theology at St. Lawrence University with Jeffrey. In response, the editor of the Christian Leader, Jan van Schaik, published an editorial in which he condemned mixed marriages because of ostensibly the hardship they caused to the children. The editorial was a thinly veiled attack on the Davis-Campbell wedding, and more specifically, Jeffrey's role as officiant in the wedding. In the editorial, he wrote, Would it be right to withhold a Universalist pulpit from a man who has contracted a marriage of this kind? It would be right because the man cannot do the work. In a letter to the Christian leader in 1942, John Murray Atwood, Dean of St. Lawrence, noted that Francis, Marguerite's husband, still had no ministry. Because of Davis's skill and ability, in addition to the shortage of credentialed Universalist ministers, Atwood concluded that this could only be because of the racism directed towards Davis's wife, Marguerite. Indeed, Davis never found a ministry and instead became a social worker. Like her brother, Marguerite was dedicated to the Universalist denomination. In the 1950s, Marguerite began work at the Universalist Christian Association and continued to serve the denomination after the merger at the newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association. Marguerite only retired from this work shortly before her death in 1982. There's not much documentation about Marguerite's life. There's not as much about her life as there is about Jeffrey's. We can only imagine what it would have been like for her to serve a denomination that continually refused to support her, as well as her brother and her husband in their ministries. We need also to remember their mother, Lillian. We know even less of her story. We know her husband was murdered because he was a black man. And we know she served the National Universalist Church as a secretary for several years. We are left to wonder, what did she endure, this white widowed single parent of 2 black children?
Throughout his life, Jeffrey Campbell did not hesitate to name the racism and discrimination he experienced at the hands of Universalists and Unitarian Universalists, perhaps most publicly in his 1940 article for the Christian Leader entitled Personality, Not Pigmentation, which was written in response to the editor's racist attack on him. In this article, Jeffrey writes of many instances of, quote, the paradox between intention and action, end quote, that he had experienced in the Universalist denomination. On the one hand, there was a faith that spoke of a belief in the, quote, universal brotherhood of man, end quote. On the other hand, their actions said something different altogether. As Jeffrey put it in his article, quote, it is the refusal of men to act on the reality of their common brotherhood which has produced the hell in which we blindly struggle today, end quote. Throughout the article, Jeffrey writes not only of his disappointment in Universalism to live up to its ideals, but also his unwavering faith that it was a denomination worth supporting nonetheless. He describes Universalists as a, quote, band of men and women who, in the increasing chaos, see a new heaven and a new earth. And it is clear that he writes this article because he truly believes Universalism can and should become the faith it declares itself to be.
Jeffrey and Marguerite are not the only black Unitarian Universalists who have seen what our faith could be and seen it fail time and time again to live up to that vision. This is a common story, more common than we would like to admit. One of the reasons that Unitarian Universalists across our country are working to confront racism and white supremacy in our midst is because we know this legacy and because we know we can and should do better. Every year, our Unitarian Universalist Association chooses a book that they call a common read, encouraging all UUs to engage with it. This year's common read is deeply relevant to the story of the Campbell family and to our work for reconciliation and repair. The book is called On Repentance and Repair. Making Amends in an Unapologetic World. It's written by Rabbi Danya Rutenberg and is a powerful call to engage in the work of repentance and repair as a way to transform ourselves and our world. Rutenberg writes, "We can never undo what we have done. We write history with our decisions and our actions. But we also write history with our responses to those actions. We can leave the pain and the damage in our wake unattended, or we can do the work of acknowledging and fixing, to whatever extent possible, the harm that we have caused. Repentance, teshuva, is like the Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. You can never unbreak what you have broken, but with the sincere and deep work of transformation, acts of repair have the potential to make something new." Rutenberg's book describes in detail the work of 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, who names 5 essential steps in the work of repentance and repair: naming and owning harm, starting to change, making amends, restitution and consequences, apology, and making different choices. These steps don't always go in quite this order. In fact, Rutenberg points out that step 2, that transformation piece, may be the work of a lifetime, and thus other steps may well happen concurrently. Though we were not familiar with these particular steps when we started to engage with the Campbell story, I can see how much of what we have done fits into those 5 steps, and I also see how much more we have to do. Telling the story of the Campbell family, locating their gravesite, placing and dedicating the marker, naming our chapel, the Campbell Chapel, apologizing to Jeffrey's daughter, raising money for Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism are all concrete steps we have taken to honor these spiritual ancestors. During the memorial and dedication service held here in September 2018, Executive Vice President of the UUA, Carrie McDonald, apologized on behalf of the entire denomination to Jocelyn Campbell, Jeffrey's daughter, who attended. We wanted to share a very brief clip of that apology.
I want to offer, on behalf of the UUA, a humble apology to Jeffrey, Marguerite, Lillian, Francis, their family. Their daughter Jocelyn is here today. I apologize. I apologize for the slanderous words that we printed in our publications. I apologize for the ways in which we did not help these reverends find a pulpit, and for not honoring their ministry properly. But I also need to say thank you. Thank you for believing in us, for believing in this faith, for casting your lot with us, because I know it cost you dearly. I can only imagine what would have been illuminated had the brilliant light of these ancestors been permitted to shine to its fullest. May we choose a different path as a congregation and a community and a wider faith that allows us to live up to the aspiration that you had for us. Thank you.
It was powerful to be here when that apology happened. And all of these partial steps are meaningless if we don't continue that work of step 2, transformation. Making sure that if we are ever in the same situation again, we do the 5th step, making different choices. There is so much more that I could say about repentance and repair as it relates to the Campbell family and to our world at large. But instead of continuing to talk, I want to invite you to 2 opportunities to go deeper with this. First is our coffee conversation after the service today. We'll share a slightly longer clip of that apology and have time for conversation. And second is a book discussion of Rabbi Danya Rutenberg's book on repentance and repair. It'll be on April 1st, and there'll be more info shared. Our work of repentance and repair for the actions of our spiritual ancestors towards the Campbell family is not over. We must continue to speak about Jeffrey and Marguerite. When our children in the Faith Formation Wing or visitors to our church ask, "Who are the Campbells?" when they see our chapel, we must tell them. Further, we can honor the Campbells by continuing our work to dismantle white supremacy in our congregation, in our faith, and in our society at large. Jeffrey saw so clearly what our faith could be if we truly lived into our ideals. Let us honor him by working to make it so.